Hello, everybody. The English and the French, always a problem. Centuries of cultural interaction, and like most families, hatred, love, and conflict. In all honesty, the French beat us hands down when it comes to cuisine, wine, and even, dare I say it, bread and cheese. My son Joseph, who retails specialty English cheeses, will disagree with that judgment, but let it stand for now. I'll argue that there's nothing like a good ripe camembert with a glass of cold white wine. In general, as is often the case with cousins, we despise each other, the English and the French. They think our food is awful, our culture crude and overbearing. And we, les sales Anglais, believe that the frogs know one thing about warfare: how to surrender. And they eat snails too. And yet, it's fair to say, to quote the French writer Claude Gagnère, quote, "A man who speaks 3 languages is trilingual. A man who speaks 2 languages is bilingual. But the person who speaks only 1 language is English," which brings me to my subject today. I thought I would drop the depressing thoughts of Gaza and lectures about the unbreathable air in Bangkok and give you a lighter, more literary tone today. After all, this channel started by focusing on books. So looking at language and some of the history seems like a good change of pace. The other day, I found a post on my LinkedIn from a respected connection, Hirendra Sinji Rana. He runs a think tank that promotes the business cooperation between the Nordic countries and India. He also posts fascinating information about India, its history, its culture and architecture, wonderful stuff from which I have learned a great deal. But this time he jumped into a minefield, the relationship between England and France. I don't know, but perhaps what was on his mind was that the British Raj had its roots in the conflict between these 2 countries. The Carnatic Wars occurred in the middle of the 18th century along India's coast near Hyderabad, with a background of Anglo-French conflict in Europe. A proxy war was fought in India, with the British emerging as the regional power. In any case, he posted based on a question raised in another social media site, Quora. The question was, if Britain had won the 100 Years' War, would France have become a British province? The question itself seems moot. Neither occurred. But I objected to a couple of things. Britain didn't fight the various conflicts known as the 100 Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453. In fact, there were several different phases, 3 in fact, but never mind. The English fought the French over claims to the French throne, and the Scots and the Welsh sided with the French, while various principalities on the continent fought with the English. That's a minor point, and I'm not usually so pedantic. But what about the idea, as the fellow who answered this question said, that the English elite spoke French? His answer says, quote, "Since the Norman conquest, England's monarchy had spoken French. They only adopted English and reintroduced it as the language of the English government during their prolonged conflict with France. Placing them on the French throne might have delayed or prevented this from happening. re-emphasising the Frenchiness of the English monarchy and preventing a united English identity developing between the government and the people who were governed. That got me going. It's a fair point in some ways. Had England won and power transferred across the Channel, the much larger French population of about 13 million during the late Middle Ages compared to no more than 4 million in England, and that might have swamped us. After all, when Duke William of Normandy conquered Saxon England in 1066, the larger, more populated country changed Anglo-Saxon culture forever. The conquest strongly influenced the English language in general, and particularly the language of the law. But it was not until 1275 that French was imposed as the language of the law, and that lasted for just 87 years. By the way, you can read about the conquest in my novel, Gateway to Gandamak, To the Gate. My name, Quartermaine, is Norman French. Yes, I'm the descendant of illegal migrant invaders who killed the Saxon king. Watch out, there are plenty of precedents. But whatever the merits of this fellow's case, the guy who answered this Quora question, I couldn't let the language issue make the argument. Furthermore, Hirendra Singh's covering post on LinkedIn seemed to imply that the English monarchy had a French leaning up to the Napoleonic War, which started around 1802. I may have misunderstood him, but I wanted to get it all straight. So I pointed out that in the 18th century, British monarchs were German, but long before, in 1362, an Act of Parliament, the Statute of Pleading, attempted to ban French as the official language. And this got us into an intriguing discussion about precisely who spoke what and when. Remember, the British Isles were settled by people who became Welsh, Scots, and Irish. The earliest people probably spoke a language that's called Brittonic. It's a Celtic language in Britain and Brittany. The Romans conquered much of the island in AD 43, and Latin influenced much of the language, especially in law and religion. 5 centuries later, I'm jumping because a step-by-step account would take all day, Anglisk, a Germanic language, entered with Anglo-Saxon invaders. In the north and east of England, known as Danegeld, Norse settlers introduced their language. The fusion of these settlers' dialects became Old English. The conquest meant that Old English borrowed from Old French, spoken in northern France until the mid-14th century. And this mishmash evolved into Anglo-Norman French, a langue d'oil, based on Latin and French with Norse links. So the real picture is of a population that had 3 main languages. The common folk speak with what becomes Middle English. The administration, law, and religious classes speak Latin at work and probably Anglo-Norman at home. And the elite speaks a version of continental French that likely sounds close to Anglo-Norman. So the picture is complicated, and I'd suggest far too complicated to hang any political judgment upon. Certainly not going back to the 100 Years' War. Still, I have to admit that speaking French in the Middle Ages does accrue prestige and perhaps a veneer of sophistication. So how about later? Well, my friend Hirendra Singh points out that with the restoration of the monarchy in England in 1660, writers like John Dryden admired the Académie Française. Dryden deplored that the English had, I quote, not so much as a tolerable dictionary or a grammar, so that our language is in a manner barbarous, unquote. Hirendra Singh suggests that with Dryden and Swift, Jonathan Swift, who you may know from the book about Lilliput, the English language reached its full maturity. I'd say more evidence is needed for that assertion. It's a simplification to claim that they represent the language's full maturity. There have been significant developments in English since then in literature and language, since the time of Dryden and Swift, who lived in the 1700s. Nevertheless, they are significant figures in English literature and made notable contributions to the language. Dryden played a role in standardizing English language and refining its literary forms. Samuel Johnson, another major figure, published a dictionary in 1755, and Robert Louth published his textbook on English grammar in 1761. These gentlemen lived and worked during a period of continuous warfare between England and France. The Carnatic Wars that I mentioned before started in 1746, and in total in the 1700s, the 18th century, there were 6 distinct conflicts between England and France. I really doubt this was a time when English folk thought much about the superiority of the French language. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Bit different from the last couple of episodes. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up and please subscribe. See you next time.